Anthony, if anyone has questions, please raise your hand and I'll come to you as we go around.
Anthony Rowley. I write for various publications, including the South China Morning Post. Your analysis of Japan was very simple and very startling. So my question is equally simple. What, if anything, can Japan do to avoid, disappearing? Secondly, do you think that the sheer amount of money printing has distorted the ability of stock markets to make rational judgments about stock values? And finally, if I quickly may, do you have any views on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange's bid to take over the London Stock Exchange?
Oh, my. I hope, Anthony, we have time for other people, too. Well, again, this is simple arithmetic. The debt goes up every day. The population goes down. Yes, recently, to my delight and surprise, the Japanese government said, okay, we're going to let in foreigners. And we're going to let in 375,000 foreigners over 5 years. Well, that's 70,000 a year, 75,000 a year, which is wonderful as a gesture. But this is a country of 125 million people, and that's not going to solve the problem. Japan doesn't like foreigners, as you know, but at least they've started opening the door and letting in some foreigners, which they desperately need. But again, this is arithmetic. What should they do? Mr. Abe's, his solution at the moment is to raise taxes. Oh my God. This is the last thing Japan needs. You already have a country where the birth rate has collapsed, and the birth rate has collapsed partially because people know something's wrong. I mean, I can't sit, I could read my book and find out what's wrong, but basically people just know subconsciously something's wrong here. What do we do? And when you know something's wrong, you don't rush out and have a lot of children. I recently read, or not recently, but a few years ago, that the #1 ambition for Japanese teenagers is to work for the government. Well, that's not a country that has a promising future, where everybody wants to work for the government. The countries with promising government futures is where 18 years go into the garage and go on the computer and start figuring out new and exciting things that they can do, such as is happening in some countries now, Silicon Valley, China, etc. So I'm not happy about what's happening here. What Mr. Abe should do, well, he's not going to resign, but let's assume he stays there. He should cut taxes instead of raising taxes, but more important, he should cut spending with an axe, not with an axe, with a chainsaw. The problem with the situation in Japan is not going to be solved with higher taxes and higher debt. You need to do something to encourage people to create again. After the Second World War, Japan became the most successful country in the world. For 20 or 30 years there, there was no country that could compare to what Japan did and was doing and could do. But in the past 30 years, 40 years, all you've done is build up debt and taxes and build highways to nowhere, which is not the way to succeed. Now that takes a radical mindset to change, but it's not going to happen. Maybe it will happen in the next crisis, whether it's a currency reset or not. In the next crisis, something will happen, but I'm not optimistic that it can change or will change. Not simple. As far as Hong Kong taking over London, well, it's part of the whole shift. The 19th century was the century of the UK. The 20th century was the century of the US. The 21st century is the century of Asia, whether we like it or not, especially China. I sold my house in New York a few years ago and moved to Asia. My children both speak fluent Mandarin because I wanted them. My preparation for the 21st century for them was to make sure they know Asia and speak fluent Mandarin. So that's not going to make them successful, of course, but at least they will have a leg up on the future. And so that what you're talking about is Asia's where the money is now. China, Taiwan, Singapore, the people, Korea, the people who have the money. And it's part of a trend which historians will look back one day and say, oh yeah, see, these were all steps along the way of the shift from Asia, from Europe and the West to Asia. Will it succeed? Probably not. Probably not right now, because there are too many vested interests in the UK and in the West who will scream and yell about, oh, horrible Asians, horrible Chinese, and look at Hong Kong, they're in the streets. So it's easy to pull out propaganda against it happening. Will it happen in our lifetime? Yes. There's more and more movement from Europe, from the West to the East, whether we like it or not. And what was your second question?
Well, I just asked whether, given the sheer amount of money which is being printed, whether the ability of stock markets to make rational judgments.
Oh, well, no, that's a good question. You know, all this money that's being printed is going somewhere. A lot of it is going into markets. The Japanese central bank quite openly tell you. So I said there'd be a shock 30 years ago for somebody to say this. But they say every day we're going to print money, we're going to buy government bonds, and we're going to buy ETF. We're going to put it in the stock market. And they're doing it. I doubt if the Japanese stock market will be where it is now had the central bank not printed such staggering amounts of money and put it into the stock market. But likewise, I doubt if any stock market in the world would be where it is now had not central banks printed so much money. The American Central Bank alone has increased its balance sheet by over 500%. That's not a typo, 500% since 2008. 30 years ago, they would have been arrested for doing something like that. Now they're honored and called maestros.
Yes, the lady at the back.
Hello, I'm Minjong Lee, stocks reporter with Bloomberg News in Tokyo, originally from South Korea. As a veteran investor, and given all the uncertainty surrounding us right now, like ultra-low interest rates, trade war, what can you tell us about your long-term strategy, 5 years or more, in terms of asset category, region, anything?
To survive. I hope I'm smarter, because they're good. They're very tumultuous times coming. I hope that I get it right. Many people are going to disappear. I hope I'm not one of them. At the moment, I don't own any shares in the United States. For instance, with the United States stock market's at all-time highs. I'm not buying shares many places. I am buying shares in Russia as we speak, looking for investments in China. I would like to find, as South Korea, as the 38th parallel disappears, I'm excited about the Korean Peninsula. The Korean Peninsula is going to be the most exciting, I'm not going to call it a country, but it's going to be the most exciting place in the world for the next 10 or 20 years when the 38th parallel is completely open. I am looking for investments in various and sundry places. I bought a few shares in Zimbabwe recently. Nobody cares about Zimbabwe, but there are places where there are opportunities. If I could, I would invest in Venezuela. I went there recently, but I'm an American citizen, so I cannot invest in Venezuela. I'm a citizen of the land of the free. We're not very free in the land of the free. Most of you can invest in Venezuela. I cannot, but if I were you, I would certainly be looking at Venezuela, places like that. I have learned in my investing career that when a country turns into a catastrophe, usually if you invest there in 5 or 6 years, you look like a genius. So if any of you have any interest in Venezuela, I would urge you to start looking there. But for the most part, I'm not rushing out to buy shares in most places in the world right now. I'm certainly open to new places. Vietnam, I recently was in Vietnam. Myanmar is opening its markets to foreigners. They just changed the law. I shouldn't tell you all this, but Myanmar will be a good place to invest short. There are only 5 stocks listed, so don't think you can rush out and buy a lot. And it's still very complicated. It's almost impossible. They changed the law to make it so foreigners could invest, but then they didn't change other things, so it's still very difficult to invest in Myanmar, but I would urge you to learn about Myanmar. I would urge you to learn about Zimbabwe. I would urge you to learn about Venezuela. North Korea, I would urge you to learn about. Russia, I am buying shares in Russia as we speak. I will be buying Russian government bonds in rubles down the road. These are some, agriculture is very, I'm optimistic about agriculture. Agriculture has been an unmitigated disaster for 30, 35 years. It's so bad that the average age of farmers in America is 58. The average age in Japan is 66. The highest rate of suicide in the UK is in agriculture. You know about Indian farmers committing suicide. You know, more people in America study public relations than study agriculture. I mean, agriculture is a disaster, an unmitigated disaster, but you have a word in Japanese, kiki. Is it kiki? Yeah. You know, which is like the Chinese word, wei qi, that disaster and opportunity are the same thing. So if you don't like your job in Tokyo, you might, and you like the outdoors, you might think about becoming a farmer. In Japan, there are huge empty stretches of land because all the farmers have died and their children have gone to Osaka or somewhere. So you might consider agriculture in many parts of the world. Do you know how to drive a tractor? See? Perfect example. I bet you nobody, very few people in this room can drive a tractor. Room full of successful, educated people, none of them can drive a tractor. There's an opportunity.